Hello, beloveds, and welcome to Christian Emotional Recovery, a podcast for those who are survivors of childhood trauma, emotional neglect, and narcissistic abuse. This podcast is hosted by Rachel Leroy, a college professor and trauma survivor. Many of us spend years trying to heal and don't get anywhere. We don't always target the trauma itself, which is so often what keeps us stuck. This podcast is where faith meets science. Rachel is an emotional healing expert with 20 years of experience applying healing modalities that helped her start making progress after nothing else worked. She'll show you how to do the same. Each week, we'll cover a topic that will show you how to heal trauma for good. Please check out our website and show notes at ChristianEmotionalRecovery.com and join the Facebook community, Trauma Survivors Unite, Christian Emotional Recovery.
Hello, beloveds, and welcome to podcast number 15 in Christian Emotional Recovery. I'm Rachel Leroy, and I wanted to thank you so much for joining me on this podcast today, which is entitled The Power of Repetition to Heal from Childhood Trauma, How a Relationship with God Can Heal Trauma. And I wanted to invite you to join my YouTube channel if you haven't done so already. It's called Stop Striving and Start Thriving. And I also wanted to encourage you to check out the community on Facebook. It's small, but it's growing, and we're working to get it more active. And it's an interactive community of like-minded people like you who are looking for a place to share support, ideas, like-minded experiences, and healing strategies to help know that you're not alone. And so it's called Trauma Survivors Unite Christian Emotional Recovery. Trauma Survivors Unite Christian Emotional Recovery. And my YouTube channel has my podcast, but it also has other resources that my podcast doesn't have. And the Facebook group is also a place where you can interact with other like-minded people. And also, if you're interested in editing, I have a website, and I'm a book editor and coach. And so check out my website at rachelleroy.com. That's rachelleroy.com. If you're working on any kind of self-development, Christian or memoir book that is to make the world a better place, to change people's lives, and to make an impact in the world, then I can help you to work that baby into existence and to edit it so that it's all that it can be and it can change lives. So check that out too if you're interested. But I wanted to tell you a little bit about today's podcast and make a disclaimer. I am not claiming that if you have a relationship with God, all of your trauma will suddenly disappear. And I'm also not saying that faith alone or a relationship with God alone will heal all of your trauma. I encourage you, as always, to seek professional help, either from a medical professional or someone in the psychology community, such as a psychotherapist or a psychiatrist, to help you on your healing journey, especially if you experience complex trauma, complex PTSD, anxiety, suicide ideation, depression, bipolar disorder, or any symptoms that are similar to those. So please get professional help. I believe in a holistic approach. I do believe that God heals some people instantaneously, and I do believe that just the body of Christ does heal some people, but I don't believe that that's the case for most people. Most people need a holistic approach to their healing. So please consider this as one type of healing among several things that you're doing, including daily practice, your relationship with God, which is part of what I'm talking about here, and getting professional help and doing what your professional practitioners guide you to do in terms of mutual decisions about what's best for your recovery. So I wanted to talk about the power of repetition to heal from childhood trauma, though, and how the nature of trauma, how a relationship with God, when it's equally as powerful as childhood trauma, can actually heal you. And some people will say, well, if you have an experience of God, you don't necessarily choose that. It just kind of happens to you. I'm of the persuasion that a relationship with God is a combination of grace that happens to you, but grace happens to you because you're persistent and you're doggedly determined and you're tenacious and you won't give up and you're fierce and you come back and you do it over and over and over and over again in terms of your emotional healing, and you're a person after God's own heart. And I believe that scripture about David being a person after God's own heart, he wrote so many Psalms, he wrote so many scriptures, and I believe that he spent a lot of time in his practice, in meditation, in prayer, in song, in praise, in worship, in the pursuit of his relationship with God, that God's love overtook him and that it became an experience for him. And that's what he talks about a lot of in the Psalms. Sometimes he's like, God, where are you? I'm blue, I'm depressed, I'm sad, I am sweating tears all over my couch, I feel alone. But there were those peak moments like Maslow talks about, where he talks about how glorious God is and how overtaken he is by God's goodness and generosity and love and his gratitude of that. And it's not that we just ride those highs. It's a stable pursuit regardless of how we feel. And there are those moments that get us through, right? So first I wanted to go to an article that I found that is based in deep psychological research. And this is actually an older article that was written in 1989 in the Psychiatric Clinics of North America, Volume 12, Number 2, pages 389 to 411. And it was published in June of 1989. But a lot of the research has stood the test of time, and a lot of it's still true. And we've simply built on this research since then in terms of what does trauma do to the mind? What does it do to the body? How is it embedded in our brains and in our bodies? Why do we repeat trauma? I spent so many years of my life repeating these patterns, and I would do all this healing work. I would take classes and I would read books and I would write in my journal and I would pray, and nothing, it just seemed like I just kept repeating these patterns and I couldn't break the cycle. And so I want to talk a little bit about the nature of the cycle and how it impacts our minds and our bodies and our spirits and our brains. And then I want to talk about how a relationship with God can actually help us when we have attachment trauma, for example, and when we have a trauma response because of either separation, lack of having a bond with a parental figure, or by being emotionally neglected or abused. How can God fill that void? How can we use daily practice of connecting with God and with Christ very consciously, very conscientiously, very fiercely to help us to fill that void and break that trauma cycle, that trauma response, especially where it comes to relationships, where it comes to toxic loneliness, and where it comes to a trauma response that has to do with bonds and attachment bonds. Okay, so I wanted to read a few key passages from this article, so bear with me because this is based in, like I said, strong scientific research that's been around for 30 years. And basically, it talks about the fact that when we experience trauma, a lot of what traumatizes us and causes trauma is when we don't get the bond with our mothers or even our fathers or the other people around us that we need. Maybe we weren't held or picked up when we were a baby. Maybe we weren't touched. Maybe we were even in a situation that was unstable, that was loud, that was uncertain, that was unsafe. And we pick up on that. Children, babies are so much more intuitive and so much more impacted by their environments from the time they're born. Not even from the time they're a few months old and they can see what's going on around them, from the time they're born. And the first 2 months of development can determine whether or not somebody has a healthy life in terms of trauma, brain development, and all that. And so if a child is nurtured and they feel safe and they get that skin-to-skin contact and they form that bond with their mother or with someone else that's a safe caregiver, then they're less likely to experience that trauma. But somebody who doesn't experience that is exponentially more likely to experience that kind of trauma, and also people that are abused and neglected as well. And so re-experiencing trauma is something that's part of the nature of trauma. It becomes a feedback loop in our brains. The neurotransmitters are wired with that trauma, and it just repeats that cycle over and over, like playing a tape over and over and over again. And then it makes you feel helpless, and it makes you feel angry, and it makes you feel like there's nothing you can do about it, and you feel like you're just this ghost that's reliving this moment in time over and over that you can never break out of and move forward. And that's basically what childhood trauma is. At some point in the stages of development, you didn't move to the next stage like you needed to. You didn't get what you needed and go through the steps and the process of moving to the next step of psychological development, and you're stuck there, reliving the same moment over and over and over again. And so basically, there's a part called re-experiencing after adult trauma, and it talks about how this can happen with adults as well, but it's especially true with children because your mind is, as you know, malleable when you're young, and then when it gets set, people think that they're screwed for life because they are programmed with these trauma responses and these feedback loops and these patterns playing over and over in their mind, and they don't know how to shut them off. And so let's look at this. Social attachment and the trauma response. That's about the bond you get or don't get with your mother, your father, your brothers, your sisters, your grandparents, your caregivers, whoever they may be. And it says, human beings are strongly dependent on social support for a sense of safety, meaning, power, and control. Even our biologic maturation is strongly influenced by the nature of early attachment bonds. Traumatization occurs when both internal and external resources are inadequate to cope with external threat. Physical and emotional maturation, that includes those stages of development, and I'll include an article that shows you those stages. Physical and emotional maturation, as well as innate variations in physiologic reactivity to perceived danger, play important roles in the capacity to deal with external threat. The presence of familiar caregivers also plays an important role in helping children modulate their physiological arousal. So in the absence of a caregiver, children experience extremes of under and over arousal that are physiologically aversive or negative and disorganizing. So the availability of a caregiver who can blindly be trusted with their own resources are inadequate. When their own resources are inadequate is very important in coping with threats. And that's usually what the child did not get. So if the caregiver, it says, is rejecting and abusive, children are likely to become hyper-aroused. And that's where that feedback loop of childhood trauma begins. And so when the persons who are supposed to be sources of safety and nurturance become simultaneously the sources of danger against which protection is needed, that's really sad and ironic, but there it is. Children maneuver to reestablish some sense of safety. Instead of turning on their caregivers and thereby losing hope for protection, children just don't do that. They blame themselves. They become fearfully and hungrily attached and anxiously obedient. Bowlby, one of the experts that they refer to, calls this a pattern of behavior in which avoidance of them competes with the desire for proximity and care, in which angry behavior is apt to become prominent. And that's how people become established in a traumatic cycle, and they repeat those patterns with other people in their lives, not just their parents, with friends, with lovers, with anybody that comes into their life that becomes a significant relationship. So that shows you what happens at the beginning. The separation response, please bear with me. The reason I'm showing you all of this is because I want you to understand the process and how a trauma cycle begins in terms of not getting what you need or getting something you don't need with the caregivers in your life, the adults and the older people around you. The separation response. Bear with me, I've got laryngitis, so I may be a little hoarse. Primates, which includes humans, have evolved highly complex ways to maintain attachment bonds. They are intensely dependent on their caregivers at the start, obviously. In lower primates, his dependency is principally expressed in physical contact. In humans, this is supplemented by verbal communication. McLean suggests that language is an evolutionary development from the mammalian separation cry that induces caregivers to provide safety, nurturance, and social stimulation. Then skipping forward, it says, thus, small children unable to anticipate the future experience separation anxiety as soon as they lose sight of their mothers. Bowlby has described the protest and despair phases of their response in great detail. As people mature, they develop an ever-enlarging repertoire of coping responses. And if you have a good upbringing and a good bond, those coping responses become automatic because you've learned them from your mother and your father. But adults are still intensely dependent upon social support to prevent and overcome traumatization. And under threat, they may still cry out for their mothers. And so we need a connection with other people. Even if you're an extrovert, an introvert, you need a connection. You need a bond. And that loss creates a loss inside of you that feels like it cycles through over and over and over again. And then some people will fool themselves into thinking that they can do everything by themselves, but we can't do anything without God. And God can become that love. He can become our mother. He can become our father. He fills in that void. And it's, those traumas, those separation traumas are powerful. And so we need something equally powerful to overcome them. Because if it's not as powerful or more powerful than our trauma, then it won't help us stop the cycle. And God's love, I've learned this from my own experience, is powerful, and it can stop and help us heal from the trauma cycle in conjunction with these other holistic approaches. So it says sudden uncontrollable loss of attachment bonds is an essential element in the development of post-traumatic stress syndromes. On exposure to extreme terror, even mature people have protest and despair responses. That's that reperpetuation of the trauma response. Anger, grief, intrusion, and numbing that make them turn toward the nearest available source of comfort to return to a state of both psychological and physiological calm. Thus, severe external threat may result in renewed clinging and things like that. It can create these psychological issues where adults have not developed the way they need to. And sometimes I believe that is where addiction comes from. I think that addiction would almost, not quite, but almost be non-existent if it weren't for this issue right here, if you put it down to one thing. And it's the variations of it are infinite. But I believe that's where a lot of addiction comes from. And that's why in 12-step programs, in AA meetings, a lot of what they talk about is surrender to a higher power. Because that fills that void for that need of a bond. And it helps to interrupt that trauma cycle if it's powerful enough. But it does need to be powerful enough. And that's why I want to talk about specific daily practices and a mindset and resources that you can use to help interrupt that cycle. So let's look at a couple of other things that'll give you some more insight on how to break this cycle. There's another section in this article called Addiction to Trauma. And so if you keep replaying this feedback loop in your brain over and over and over again, that is not your fault. That is simply a sign that you're human. The thing is you and only you, with God's help, have the power to stop that cycle. It's hard. It's freaking hard. I know. I've been there. It takes you may fail the first 100 times you do it, but you have to keep doing it. You have to completely surrender to God. You have to be willing to do whatever it takes. You've got to be fierce. And if you're fierce and tenacious and you keep doing it, inevitably you will find some healing and some peace. So, addiction to trauma. Some traumatized people remain preoccupied with trauma at the expense of other life experiences. That's part of the trauma cycle, and continue to recreate it in some form for themselves and for others. War veterans may enlist as mercenaries, for example. Victims of incest may become prostitutes, and victims of childhood physical abuse seemingly provoke subsequent abuse in foster families or become self-mutilators. That is not their fault. There has to be a way to get into the source and the cause and the root of that behavior in order to stop it. Still, others identify with the aggressor and do to others what was done to them. For example, if a boy was sexually molested, he might be more likely to do that to other people, though not everybody who does that. Clinically, these people are observed to have a vague sense of apprehension, emptiness, boredom, and anxiety when not involved in activities reminiscent of the trauma. Many observers of traumatic bonding have speculated that victims become addicted to their victimizers, and that's called Stockholm Syndrome. And basically, that's where you bond with the people that abused you or neglected you. And if it's your parents, how can you not? But in other cases, it's true too. And so it talks about what's called endogenous opiates and attachment. And I just want to summarize some of it here. Basically, it says that attachment to people becomes a way to get a fix, so to speak. When that hyperarousal or that understimulation that is out of balance that comes from that trauma response comes up, it is our conditioned response to do something that can be self-harming, and we may not even be consciously aware of it, maybe forming a bond with an abuser or with somebody who doesn't treat us right in order to soothe that trauma response, right? That fight or flight, that emotional pain. And so high levels of stress, including social stress, can activate those systems. They are literally the opioids in our brain, and they have a very similar response to the addiction to opioids that you get in a bottle. And so it's very similar to addiction. And so to break that cycle, you've got to get to the root of what caused it. And you've got to give yourself something in its place. And I'm not going to go into all the science of that, but you can read this article if you want. And basically it talks about treatments and, interrupting the cycle. The summary, though, I thought was very interesting because it basically boils down this whole concept. And it says trauma can be repeated on behavioral, emotional, physiological, and neuroendocrinologic levels. And repetition on these different levels causes large varieties of individual and social suffering. Anger directed against the self or others is always a central problem in the lives of people who have been violated, and this in itself is a repetitive reenactment of real events from the past. And so people need a safe base for normal social and biologic development. And that's where I'm saying that God can be part of that safe base. You need a relationship with loving and kind people. You need bonds with those people. You also need to be able to form a bond with yourself. And, I know this is controversial. I know not everybody agrees with this, but I believe that the inner child is that part of you that hasn't reached the development that he or she needs to. And that child needs you to nurture him or her just like you would if it were your own child. Or, and you can take yourself with God's help through those stages of development that you didn't get. You can fulfill those needs for yourself in conjunction with allowing God to be a safe base. So how does God come into this? I believe that you need a concrete cultivation of experiencing God as a safety net, of experiencing God's acceptance and overpowering grace and love on a visceral level through the power of repetition and reinforcement, and that can help break the cycle. So how do you do that? I believe some of the ways that you can do that are through strong, safe relationships with other people, self-compassion, mindfulness. Praise and worship has been amazing for me. I have done some mantras that I would sing over and over again to help build my bond with God, and it does things to help interrupt that cycle in your brain. It creates new powerful neurotransmitter connections in your brain. And some of that is also, like I said, praise and worship, where if you can just let that healing light come in, when you sing, it creates vibrations in the body and releases specific brainwave patterns that are healing, and they help to break those trauma cycles as well. And that is connecting with God himself, with God's love, I believe. And so if you can do praise and worship, find songs that resonate with you and sing them. Sing them quietly and meditatively. Praise God. Put your hands in the air. Let that come out of your soul and out of your spirit. And you'll feel in your experience how awesome God is, how powerful he is. You'll have his healing love come to you in a very physical, literal, visceral experience. And I believe that powerful prayer can do that. Powerful meditation can do that. And I think meditation with music is very powerful. And some combination of meditation, prayer, and praise and worship, if you can find one that works for you, is also powerful in experiencing the visceral, overpowering grace and love of God repetitively. But you have to keep doing it over and over and over again. And when something gets old, experiment and try something new. Try a new version or variety of something you've already been doing. And that gives you a safe base for normal social and biological development, where if you didn't get that as a child, you'll start going through those stages of development by interrupting that trauma cycle. Whatever happened will finish playing through. And then if that trauma experience finishes playing through, it releases out of your body. And it's the repetition that helps you to do that. And then sometimes one time is all it takes. But most of the time it takes dozens or hundreds of repetitions. And do it because you love God. Do it with pure intentions in mind. And I think it helps you to get further along than if you're like, it's not working. So don't force it. Be kind to yourself. Be patient with yourself. It took a long time for these patterns to get down into your body and into your mind. And so making those new neural connections and interrupting the old ones, breaking them, snapping them apart, that's going to take time too. You're not going to snap the whole thing at once. You're going to snap one string of it. There's hundreds of them, and each wire, one's going to snap. Ching, ching, ching. Every time you do that praise and worship, every time you praise God in a difficult situation from a genuine place inside of you. Let me read this so I can show you how this particular type of activity can help you. Repetition on these different levels causes a large variety of individual and social suffering, the trauma. So you're interrupting it with something else. Anger directed against the self or others is always a central problem. It says people with a safe base for normal social and biological development, they need that. Traumatization occurs when both internal and external resources are inadequate to cope with external threat. Uncontrollable disruptions or distortions of attachment bonds precede the development of PTSD. People seek increased attachment in the face of danger. Adults as well as children may develop strong emotional ties with people who intermittently harass, beat, or threaten them. So you need to go to God. You need to learn to build a relationship of self-compassion with yourself and a compassionate relationship with God. That is where you know you will never be let down. That is where you know the best intentions in mind are there. And that is where you know powerful, real healing will occur. And then find people, even if it's just a therapist, or somebody at church, or if you're not in a church, a friend, or if there's one family member, whether it's your second cousin or your grandmother, that one bond can be everything to helping you heal. If the person has gone on, just remembering how much they loved you and made you feel safe and putting that inside of you helps. I have a grandmother who was like that for me, and just thinking about her brings back that experience for me. But it says adults as well as children may develop like I said, with people that are not appropriate. The persistence of these attachment bonds lead to confusion and pain, of pain and love. Pain and love get confused. That's pretty twisted. That's exactly what happens. And so basically, if you keep going down to the end of the article in the summary, it says people who have been exposed to highly stressful stimuli develop long-term potentiation of memory tracts that are reactivated at times of subsequent arousal. In other words, those patterns get repeated when something stressful happens that's similar, that stimulates that. And then that pattern replays. This activation explains how current stress is experienced as a return of the trauma. It causes a return to earlier behavioral patterns. Ordinarily, people will choose the most pleasant of the two alternatives. So high arousal causes people to engage in familiar behavior. So you have to interrupt that with something new, with love, with powerful testimony of God's powerful love through praise and worship, with meditation that tells you how much you are loved, that grounds you, that physically helps you to connect with yourself, with God, with the earth. And those things help to ground you, put you back in your body, so you're not having this out-of-body traumatic experience. But it says the opponent process theory of acquired motivation, blah, blah, blah. I don't even know what that means. But it explains how fear may become a pleasurable sensation. And if you have trauma bonds, fear can become a fix because you're conditioned to it and you may not know anything else. So you have to replace that. And that's where I said that daily practice of the visceral connection to God, His powerful grace, His powerful love, the love of Christ, can replace that. And it takes time. It may not even work at first, but as you create that connection and it snowballs and it gets stronger and stronger, it will become a strong pattern in your mind as well. And when that trauma response comes up, you use that experience to replace it. And so it talks about how the laws of social attachment may be identical to those of drug addiction. That's scary. Victims can become addicted to their victimizers. Social contact may activate endogenous opioid systems, alleviating separation distress and strengthening social bonds. That is why you need to find a trusted therapist or minister or priest or rabbi. That is also why you need to use God to replace that craving. Only God can fill that craving fully. And if you can do that in a visceral way through these daily practices, it'll interrupt, like I said, that pattern. Like I said, it even says high levels of social stress activate the opioid as well. For example, Vietnam vets with PTSD show opioid-mediated reduction in pain perception after re-exposure to traumatic stimulus. Not good. That's why the other healthier responses will help you to overcome that stress and that addiction. Childhood abuse and neglect enhance long-term hyperarousal and decreased modulation of strong affect states. Abused children may require higher external stimulation to affect the endogenous opioid system for soothing than when the biological concomitants of comfort are easily activated by conditioned responses based on good early caregiver experiences. Basically, what that means is if you experience childhood trauma compared to somebody who didn't, it's going to take a more powerful thing to replace that trauma response and bring that stress level down compared to somebody who has a regular stress response, who had the bonds with mom and dad that they needed. And so that's where the love of God is even more important for people who have experienced childhood trauma than anybody else. It's important for everybody, and it can help bring that stress level down. But with people who experienced abuse and neglect, it is everything. God is everything. A powerful experience of God is everything. And then having a conscious choice where you carry through even when you don't feel the love of God, knowing that by making a choice day after day after day. And the only way to do that where it resonates and it's powerful enough to interrupt that response is through a daily practice. Meditation, prayer, singing, praise and worship, things that are visceral, that get into your mind and get into your body. Victimized people, it says, may neutralize their hyperarousal by a variety of addictive behaviors. So not substituting it for something else is dangerous. You need to use healthy habits. Exercise is another one. It's not directly related to your relationship with God, but there's endless research that shows that exercise, especially vigorous exercise or something like yoga or walking or connection to nature, is also good to help heal that trauma response. It brings the stress levels down. But the only reason to uncover traumatic material, the reason we talk about this, it says, and that I'm just adding that, the reason we talk about it, it says, is to gain conscious control over unbidden re-experiences or reenactments. So it's to interrupt that trauma response, to let it play out, to help you get through those stages of development, to let God heal you and help you get through those stages of development, and to finally heal so that on the other side you are a whole human being who knows God's love. The presence of strong attachments, it says, and I'm saying like with God on a visceral level, and this is what has helped heal me, provides people with the security necessary to explore their life experiences and to interrupt the inner or social isolation that keeps them stuck in repetitive patterns. In contrast with victimized children, adults can learn to protect themselves and make conscious choices about not engaging in relationships or behaviors that are harmful. But you have to put something else in its place, and that's where those practices come into play. And Christian or non-Christian, those practices are absolutely essential for healing. And you cannot heal without putting something in its place. And so that meditation, spending time in nature, spending time quiet, praying, and praise and worship, and connections with other people, and talk therapy, and writing in your journal, it's absolutely essential for your healing. You just have to find the combination that works for you. And so that was my talk on the power of repetition to heal from childhood trauma, how the childhood trauma cycle works, and how a relationship with God can help heal trauma, among other therapies, in a holistic approach to healing childhood trauma. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to me today. I'm Rachel Leroy. This is Christian Emotional Recovery Podcast number 15. And I also have a YouTube channel called Stop Striving and Start Thriving that has all these podcasts on it. Please subscribe. And I have other resources to help you with your emotional healing. I'm working on some meditations. And I also have a YouTube group called Christian Emotional Recovery Trauma Survivors Unite. Trauma Survivors Unite Christian Emotional Recovery. Please feel free to join our community. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen, and I hope that this has benefited you. That's the whole point of this message. That's the whole point of this podcast. I absolutely love doing. It's an absolute privilege to help you on your healing journey. God bless you. God loves you. I love you. You are loved. You are fearfully and wonderfully made. Have a great day.
Thank you so much for tuning in to this week's episode of Christian Emotional Recovery, hosted by Rachel Leroy. For links to this week's resources and to join the discussion, check out this episode's show notes at christianemotionalrecovery.com, where you can also find links to our YouTube channel and Facebook group. Join our email list and get other episodes and resources. If you enjoyed the podcast, please rate and review the podcast and tell a friend who may benefit from this message. See you next time. And remember, beloveds, God loves you, and you are fearfully and wonderfully made.